The loudest person in the room is often the one with the least power. Shocking, right? Nietzsche believed that the key to true authority lies not in speaking, but in controlled silence. Imagine having the ability to destabilize arguments, expose weaknesses, and gain respect, all without uttering a single word. Stick around as we uncover how the philosophy of silence can elevate you to a position of quiet dominance. In our culture, the urge to speak up is almost automatic. You might notice it in meetings, group chats, or even casual conversations, the pressure to fill every pause, to defend your ideas, to avoid being overlooked. This isn't just a quirk of personality, it's a product of deep-rooted social norms. We commonly assume that verbal expression equals strength, and that asserting yourself out loud is the only way to be seen as confident or competent. From classrooms to boardrooms, the message is clear. If you're not speaking, you're not contributing. This belief is so ingrained that it can make silence feel like a liability, as if not saying something is the same as admitting defeat. But this association between silence and weakness is a cultural illusion. The constant drive to participate verbally is often a response to the fear of being forgotten or dismissed. In group settings, people rush to speak not only to share their ideas, but to reassure themselves and others that they matter. Silence, in this environment, gets read as passivity or indecision. Yet, if you look closer, this compulsion to fill the air with words is rarely about true confidence. More often, it's a reaction to anxiety, the worry that if you don't speak, you'll be judged, ignored, or exposed as lacking. The result? A cycle of over-explaining, oversharing, and ultimately, overexposing yourself. Think back to the last time you left a conversation frustrated, replaying every word you said. That exhaustion doesn't come from holding back. It comes from the mental strain of always having to defend your position, always having to be on. The loudest talkers in a room are frequently the ones who betray the most insecurity, piling up words as if they're building a shield. But words, when used without restraint, often do the opposite. They reveal uncertainty, need for approval, and a lack of control. Someone who feels compelled to jump into every silence is signaling that they're uncomfortable with the unknown, desperate to manage how others see them. Social psychology offers a fascinating explanation for why silence is so unsettling. It's often perceived as judgment. When you expect a response and are met with silence, your brain reacts. Modern experiments show that the amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for processing fear, activates in moments of silence, especially when you anticipate feedback. That uneasy feeling isn't just awkwardness, it's a primal response to uncertainty. You start to question yourself. Did I say the wrong thing? Are they judging me? The silence becomes a mirror, forcing you to confront your own doubts. This is why people often rush to fill the gap, over-clarifying or defending themselves before anyone else has even spoken. The irony is that the more you speak to avoid discomfort, the less control you actually have. When you reveal everything, you lose leverage. The person who can sit with silence, who isn't desperate to fill every pause, exerts a subtle form of power. Their restraint forces others to reveal more, to scramble for reassurance, to expose their own vulnerabilities. This dynamic is especially visible in tense discussions or negotiations. The one who can wait, who doesn't rush to defend or explain, shifts the balance. The loudest person may seem dominant in the moment, but their need to be heard often exposes them as the most reactive, the most easily manipulated. Instead of the chessboard metaphor, think of Nietzsche's distinction between the reactive mind and the observing mind. The reactive mind jumps to fill every silence, compelled by emotion and insecurity. The observing mind, on the other hand, waits. It watches. It doesn't reveal itself unless there's a reason. In conversation, this means resisting the urge to respond immediately, letting others show their hand first. The quiet observer gains information, maintains composure, and controls the tempo, not by dominating the conversation, but by refusing to be drawn into needless exchanges. This isn't just a theoretical idea. The emotional impact of choosing silence is real and freeing. When you stop feeling obligated to explain yourself at every turn, you reclaim energy and clarity. The regret that comes from saying too much, the fatigue of always defending your position, starts to fade. Instead, you experience a sense of calm, a feeling of being grounded in your own choices. Silence, when used deliberately, becomes a tool for self-possession and authority. Nietzsche saw this fear of silence as the ego's last stand. He argued that our drive to fill every gap with words is a symptom of herd morality, a need to conform, to be accepted, to avoid standing out by being different. But true strength, he believed, comes from restraint, from the willingness to stand apart and let others reveal themselves. What if silence isn't just the absence of sound, but a kind of weapon? Nietzsche had a sharp suspicion about the way people use words, and it wasn't flattering. Nietzsche's philosophy turns the modern obsession with constant communication on its head. He argued that speaking less is not a sign of passivity, but a deliberate strategy for power. In his critique of what he called slave morality, Nietzsche pointed out that the urge to seek approval, especially through endless chatter, is a form of weakness. The crowd rewards noise, but the individual who can rise above this, who doesn't need to justify or explain themselves, is the one who commands true authority. This isn't just about being different for the sake of it. It's about recognizing that the pressure to speak, to always contribute, is often just another way of conforming. At the center of this idea is Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch. The Übermensch is not simply someone who ignores social rules, but someone who creates values beyond social expectations and uses silence to assert presence. This figure doesn't need the herd's validation. Instead, the Übermensch chooses when to speak and, more importantly, when to remain silent. Their silence is not a void. It's a presence that fills the room, a language that commands respect and disrupts the usual power dynamics. When silence is intentional, it becomes a tool that unsettles others, making them question themselves and their assumptions. Consider a typical confrontation. One person gets caught up in defending their position, explaining and justifying every point. The other simply listens, doesn't react, and holds their silence. Quickly, the speaker unravels under the weight of that silence, exposing insecurities and over-explaining in an effort to regain control. This is exactly what Nietzsche's research points to. The more you say, the more you reveal, and the more vulnerable you become. The one who remains silent controls the tempo and the direction of the interaction. Nietzsche believed that every word is an expenditure of energy. When you speak, you give away information, sometimes more than you intend. The Übermensch understands this instinctively, conserving their energy by refusing to scatter it through unnecessary words. This makes every gesture, every pause, and every carefully chosen sentence carry far more weight than a flood of explanations. Their restraint is not about withholding out of fear, but about knowing the value of what they reveal and what they keep hidden. This stands in stark contrast to the world we live in now. Social media, meetings, group chats, every environment seems to reward those who are loudest and most reactive. If you're silent, people assume you're absent or uninterested. But Nietzsche would argue that this is a misunderstanding of power. The person who constantly speaks is the one showing their hand, exposing their emotional state and their insecurities. The silent observer, on the other hand, remains unreadable and in control. Their silence becomes a shield, making it impossible for others to manipulate them or predict their next move. When it comes to authority, this dynamic becomes even more pronounced. Think of leaders who choose their words carefully. They don't jump into every argument or feel the need to fill every silence. Instead, they listen, they watch, and they allow others to reveal themselves. When they do speak, their words are met with attention because they are rare and deliberate. The space between their words, the silence, is where respect grows. It's not about demanding attention through volume, but commanding it through presence and restraint. This approach flips the usual power structure in conversations. Most people expect a reaction, and they base their next move on how you respond. When you don't react, you take away their sense of control. They're left guessing, often revealing more of themselves in the process. Silence isn't passive. It's an active move that makes others scramble to fill the gap, exposing their own vulnerabilities in the process. If you try this in your own life, you'll see how quickly the dynamic shifts. Next time you feel pressured to explain yourself or to jump into a heated conversation, pause. Choose silence. Watch as others become unsettled, unsure of what you're thinking or planning. In that moment, you stop responding to the environment and start shaping it. Silence, when used with intention, is not an absence, but a presence that forces others to meet you on your terms. Nietzsche saw this restraint as the hallmark of true strength. But why does silence have such a powerful psychological effect? Understanding why silence triggers fear is key. Let's break down the psychology behind this unsettling effect. Picture the moment when a conversation suddenly halts. The words stop, and the silence that follows isn't just empty space, it's thick, charged, and almost uncomfortable. You see this in meetings, arguments, or even simple exchanges. Someone chooses not to respond, and the atmosphere changes instantly. The reason for this shift is rooted in our psychology. When silence falls, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, kicks in, triggering anxiety and alertness. The silence isn't passive, it's a force that unsettles, and everyone in the room feels it. As background research explains, silence functions as a psychological mirror. When no one speaks, you're left to confront your own thoughts and insecurities without a verbal shield. Most people use words as protection, to justify themselves, to seek validation, or to maintain control. When that shield drops, what's left is raw and exposed. The discomfort that follows isn't just social awkwardness, it's a direct confrontation with your own doubts. You start to wonder if you've said too much, not enough, or revealed a weakness. The urge to fill the gap becomes almost unbearable. Social psychology gives us even more insight. Silence, especially in confrontational situations, is often interpreted as judgment. Imagine you're explaining yourself to someone, expecting a reaction, but all you get is a long, measured pause. That pause feels heavy. You begin second-guessing everything you just said. Did you make sense? Did you sound foolish? Are you being silently criticized? The lack of feedback leaves you exposed, and your brain scrambles to make sense of the silence. This is the amygdala at work, amplifying your anxiety and making you hyper-aware of your own vulnerabilities. This effect is magnified in high-stakes situations like negotiations or arguments. When one person keeps talking, desperate to sway the other, and the other remains silent, calm, unmoved, the pressure builds. The speaker, faced with that silence, often tries to compensate by talking more. In doing so, they reveal more than they intend: hidden doubts, inconsistencies, or even outright weaknesses. Silence acts as a psychological lever, shifting the balance and forcing the speaker to reveal their hand. It's not the silent person who loses control, it's the one who can't stop talking. Manipulators are especially vulnerable to this tactic. Emotional manipulators thrive on reactions. They need feedback to gauge their influence and maintain control. The research makes it clear. When you refuse to react, you break their cycle. Without your response, the manipulator loses their footing. The silence becomes a void they can't fill, and their anxiety often leads them to overplay their hand, exposing the very weaknesses they work so hard to hide. Strategic silence doesn't just resist manipulation, it turns the tables, leaving the manipulator scrambling for control. There's another layer to this. Silence forces people to confront their internal narratives. When you're speaking, you're not just communicating with others, you're often convincing yourself. Words help you organize your thoughts and make your ideas feel more solid. But when you're met with silence, you're left alone with your doubts. There's no reassurance, no external validation. Many people try to win these moments by filling the silence with more words, but in reality, this only reveals how unsettled they feel. The more they talk, the more they expose. Mastering silence means resisting the urge to fill every gap. When you hold back and let silence do its work, you take control, not just of yourself, but of the room. You decide when to move the conversation forward, and you're no longer reacting to every comment or provocation. That calm, unhurried presence starts to command respect. The narrative shifts, no longer driven by the loudest voice, but by the quiet observer who shapes the energy through restraint. This is why silence doesn't just unsettle, it exposes. The person across from you loses their sense of control. Their strategies start to revolve around your silence, and as they try to fill the gap, they reveal more than they ever intended. The real power lies with the one who can sit comfortably in that tension, knowing that sometimes the most dominant move is to say nothing at all. Now that you know why silence hurts others, it's time to learn how to wield it deliberately. Up next, the 4 tactical moves. The art of strategic silence starts with understanding that silence is not simply the absence of words, but a deliberate act of control. Mastering this skill means you are not avoiding the conversation, you are shaping it. Nietzsche drew a sharp line between the reactive mind, which is easily provoked and manipulated, and the observing mind, which waits, watches, and only acts with intention. In practice, this means your first tactic is non-reaction. When provoked, whether by criticism, sarcasm, or a direct challenge, your instinct is to defend yourself or correct the record. But every immediate response signals where you are vulnerable and exposes your emotional triggers. By withholding your reaction, you break the expected pattern, and the other person is left to navigate their own uncertainty. The more you resist the urge to jump in, the more you force them to reveal their intentions, motivations, and even their insecurities. The research calls this the power of non-reaction. The simple act of not engaging can be more powerful than any comeback. Observation is the next tactical layer. Silence is not just a defensive shield, it's an active stance. When you are not speaking, you have the bandwidth to notice what others miss. This is where you become the hunter, not the prey. Watch for the subtle cues, a shift in vocal pitch when someone is nervous, or the way they repeat certain phrases when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. These details often reveal hidden insecurities and contradictions, giving you an informational advantage. The research points out that careful observation during silence allows you to read the emotional landscape of a room. You start to see the real game being played beneath the surface, and you gather data you can use later, if you choose to speak at all. Timing is the third tactic, and it is where silence transforms from passive space into an active force. A well-timed pause, especially after a loaded question or a controversial statement, creates tension that others must resolve. The research describes this as wielding an invisible blade, a pause that cuts deeper than any words could. When you hold a pause, the other person is compelled to fill it, often by over-explaining or revealing more than they intended. And when you finally do speak, your words land with far greater weight. The silence frames your speech, making every sentence feel significant. Sometimes you don't even need to break the silence at all. Simply letting the tension linger can prompt others to expose their own weaknesses. The key is that you control the tempo, not them. Consider how these tactics play out in a real-world scenario. Imagine a colleague openly criticizes your work in front of others. Your first impulse might be to defend yourself, but instead, you pause. Say nothing, maybe just maintain steady eye contact or a slight nod. According to the research, this act of non-engagement denies them the fuel of your reaction. The critic may begin to repeat themselves, over-explain, or reveal the shaky foundation of their argument. You haven't just avoided a confrontation, you've redirected the energy of the room. When you do eventually speak, you do so briefly and calmly, and the room listens. The silence you maintained made your words and your presence command attention. Unpredictability is what binds these tactics together. Most people expect a certain rhythm in conversation, especially when tension is high. If they attack, they expect you to defend. If they provoke, they expect a reaction. By refusing to follow this script, you become unreadable. The research highlights that this unpredictability shifts the gravitational center of the interaction to you. Others become cautious, unsure of what you'll do next, and in that uncertainty, you gain control. Nietzsche believed that to be unreadable is to be feared, because no one can anticipate your next move or manipulate your responses. All of this requires discipline. Non-reaction is not natural. It takes conscious effort to resist the pull of your own emotions. Observation demands patience and a willingness to be uncomfortable in silence. Timing is a skill that grows sharper the more you practice holding the pause. These are not passive traits. They are active choices that change the dynamics of every interaction. When you master them, silence becomes a weapon of precision, not a shield of avoidance. But there's a critical distinction here. Not all silence is created equal, and not every use of silence commands respect. The difference lies in your intent and your presence. If you use silence to hide, to escape, or to avoid responsibility, it can quickly slide into submission. The real challenge is knowing when your silence is a mark of mastery and when it risks signaling weakness. In every interaction, silence sends a message. Sometimes it radiates strength, drawing eyes and commanding attention. Other times, it signals withdrawal, a quiet surrender to pressure or fear. The distinction between these two forms of silence is subtle, but it shapes how others see you and how you see yourself. This is the fine line between submission and mastery. The intent behind your silence determines whether you're shaping the moment or letting it shape you. Submissive silence is easy to spot if you know what to look for. It often emerges when you want to avoid conflict, when you're hoping to escape notice, or when you're seeking approval by not rocking the boat. This kind of silence isn't neutral. It's a quiet agreement to let others set the terms. Over time, it erodes your presence and authority. Imagine a team meeting where a crucial decision hangs in the balance. If you stay silent because you're afraid of making the wrong call, you don't just avoid responsibility, you relinquish your influence. Others sense this withdrawal. They see hesitation, a lack of conviction. The silence becomes a void that others fill, and your relevance fades. According to Nietzsche, this is the morality of slaves. Silence used to avoid risk, to blend in, to be shaped by the will of others. Mastery, on the other hand, transforms silence into a tool of presence. The silence of mastery is deliberate and rooted in self-awareness. You're not escaping the moment. You're owning it. You stay quiet because you're observing, gathering information, and choosing the right moment to act. There's no urgency to prove yourself. You understand that words, once spoken, can't be taken back, and that sometimes the greatest influence comes from restraint. The observing mind, as the research suggests, stands above the need to react. It waits, it watches, and it commands the room without competing for attention. Consider the leader who remains silent during a heated debate. Their silence isn't disengagement, it's a calculated move. People instinctively analyze the intent behind that quiet. Is it confidence or avoidance? Is it strategy or fear? The leader who uses silence masterfully lets others reveal their positions, their insecurities, and their true intentions. When this leader finally speaks, the weight of their words is amplified by the silence that preceded them. The room listens, not because they demanded attention, but because they earned it through presence and control. This is the silence of the master, not the slave. Intent shapes interpretation. People don't just notice that you're silent, they sense why. If your silence comes from fear, it feels like submission. If it's anchored in confidence, it radiates strength. The difference is internal. Mastery is proactive, a conscious decision to hold your ground. Submission is reactive, a retreat from discomfort. Outwardly, both forms of silence might look the same, but their impact could not be further apart. The experience of each is distinct. Submission feels like holding your breath, waiting for something to pass, shrinking in the hope of avoiding pain. Mastery feels like calm. You're comfortable in the tension, unhurried by the need to fill the space. There's a sense of control, of being present in the discomfort rather than running from it. This is the kind of silence that unsettles others, not because you're absent, but because you're fully there, watching, waiting, and unmovable. This shift doesn't happen by accident. It begins with self-awareness and the willingness to face discomfort head-on. The silence of submission is tempting because it feels safe, but it costs you respect and authority. The silence of mastery is harder. It means sitting with tension, resisting the urge to react, and trusting that you don't need to prove yourself with words. As Nietzsche observed, the game of discussion is a theater, and the first to act, driven by a need to be seen or to defend, has already lost the upper hand. The observing mind, the one that waits, is dangerous because it cannot be manipulated or predicted. It shapes the outcome by refusing to be drawn in. Mastering silence means mastering yourself. It's not about suppressing fear or pretending to be above emotion. It's about choosing when and how to engage, and knowing that sometimes the greatest strength is in restraint. The confidence, the presence, the authority, they all flow from this inner discipline. When your silence is intentional and rooted in self-control, it changes the energy in the room. People sense it, they respond to it, and, perhaps most importantly, you feel it in yourself. Next time you find yourself silent, ask, "Am I avoiding or commanding the room?" The answer will tell you everything you need to know about the power you hold in that moment. The difference between submission and mastery is not in the silence itself, but in the choice behind it. And that choice is what sets apart those who simply remain quiet from those who truly command respect.